Former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani joins us now live from Los Angeles. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me, John. Glad to be here.
Okay, now Combs is facing 5 charges. There's 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. The racketeering and the sex trafficking are the big ones. They carry a maximum penalty of life. So did Casey Ventura's testimony move the needle on those 2 more serious charges?
John, it did. And what separates sex trafficking from ordinary sex between consenting adults is that force, fraud, or coercion. Let's set aside fraud. But Cassie did talk about coercion and force, and the coercion was the drug use. She testified that Combs would make her use drugs to the point where she would vomit, and that these freak-offs would last days, sometimes every week. And those were the elements of coercion, but we also heard testimony about force, the guns Combs had, his entourage, his security. She would be tracked, and if they were unable to contact her, they would physically find her. And obviously, we talked about the 2016 video of the beating that she suffered at the Intercontinental Hotel here in Los Angeles that was obtained by CNN. So this paints a picture of sexual activity that was not consensual. And when it comes to racketeering, typically that's something that is reserved for the mob or cartels, but it has been used in sex trafficking trials in the United States. And the most famous case, of course, being rapper R. Kelly, who was charged with racketeering.
And this is how Ventura described the sex parties that Combs would have. She said, a freak-off would typically start with oil and touching. After that, she said participants would engage in oral sex before progressing to intercourse. She'd stay awake for days at a time without sleep against her will. At times, Combs himself would urinate on her or demand an escort do so. And that's pretty tame. That's the edited version of her testimony. And while many will find those details upsetting and uncomfortable, to say the least, we have this argument being put forward by the defense, you touched on this, that immorality is not the same thing as illegality. And even the drug use and the escorts, that sort of happens every day. It's almost a run-of-the-mill sort of thing now. So how close to this line is the defense walking of actually proving the difference between what we find immoral and what is actually illegal?
Well, the defense is trying to walk that line. And the first thing they did, and this came out in the opening statement, was separating physical violence from sexual assault. They had to admit the physical violence. But what they're saying is that this was mutual combat, essentially. And Cassie Ventura did say that she was insanely jealous. I expect the defense to use that and argue that she too was violent. There was testimony of her having a black eye, it being purple, for instance. There's plenty of evidence of the physical assault, but what they're trying to do, like you said, John, is separate out that sexual violence and say that really it wasn't violent at all. In fact, it was consensual. And when you're defending a sexual assault case, there's really only 2 defenses. The first is it wasn't me and it partook in that sexual activity. Well, here there's videos of the freak-offs and plenty of independent witnesses. So the Combs' only defense here is to argue consent. And it's possible, but unlikely the jury buys it.
Well, she also testified about booking hotels, and this was interesting. She said often Combs' staff would make the arrangements. Ventura also testified that Combs tasked her with finding escorts. He had specific physical requirements and had to approve the escort, she said, adding that he wanted her to check if the person was a cop. She said some escorts participated in freak-offs in multiple states. This is the interesting part. And sometimes she, a travel agent for Combs, helped coordinate their travel. Okay, so this gets to the racketeering charge. Explain the importance here of that testimony to that charge.
Well, it's very important. So racketeering requires a criminal enterprise, and it doesn't have to be a rigid organization. It can be a loose association of 2 or more people. And anyone that helped Combs set up these freak-offs, if he is indeed convicted of sex trafficking, they're criminally liable. They're on the hook for the trafficking if they aided and abetted, even if they didn't participate in the actual sex acts. That's why, John, I expect to see some of Combs' former employees testify. They're going to know where the bodies are buried. But in addition to that, it requires RICO predicate acts. So that can be bribery. We heard testimony about that yesterday. Assault, extortion, sex trafficking, forced labor. These are all potential acts that, if proven, would prove that racketeering charge.
Yeah, and that brings that life in imprisonment. Also has, I think the sex trafficking has a minimum time in prison as well.
It does.
15 years, right?
15-year mandatory minimum.
Yeah. Hey, Neama, thanks so much for staying up. It's really good to have you with us. We appreciate the insights.
Of course, John. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.